With another week of Stage 4 completed, and now only 2 weeks left before the end of the regular season, it's time for me to update my Overwatch League power rankings, which unlike last week will be to specific positions rather than rough tiers, as I'm happier with the thoughts I have about most of the teams, having seen them play most of their matches within 2-2-2 roll-on. So let's not delay any further and get to talking about the bottom 4 teams I have. In this bottom grouping, I've got the Boston Uprising at 20, the Dallas Fuel at 19, the Toronto Defiant at 18, and the Houston Outlaws at 17. First of all, I want to make it explicitly clear that despite discussing these 4 teams in one section of this video, clearly both Toronto and Houston are far away from both Dallas and Boston in terms of their power level. Arguably, deciding who I'd put last in my power rankings was the hardest decision I had to make this week, with both teams simply looking woeful for much of this stage so far. This contributed to them being the only sides without wins so far this stage. It's not all doom and gloom, however, as these teams can take a few positives from the play of their DPS players, Culhex and AKM, who've performed quite well in the May Reaper setups being run by the two sides. Dallas sits a little higher, purely for taking the Gladiators to 5 maps. If I'm being honest, I reckon that was more down to how LA were underperforming in the first half, as suggested by how dominant they were after half time, as well as how uncompetitive the Fuel were after this good performance as they flopped against Shock. Of these two teams, I have a little more faith in the Uprising, despite their lower position, but they'll need to sort out a lot over the next 2 weeks, from their underwhelming current support pairing, confusion surrounding the flex tank position, and the fact that Stella has been performing terribly on May. Moving away from the bottom 2 though, the next team I have is Toronto. I somewhat felt bad when placing them this low in my rankings, given how well on paper the Defiant appeared to be performing. They have a win over Shanghai, took Seoul and Philly close, whilst winning a map off both Washington and London. That said, despite looking much more competitive with their new roster, with Logics in particular playing outstandingly, the team seems to lack a general sense of direction or philosophy, which Gods has mentioned is partly down to their coaching situation following the departure of Bishop. If anything, this team right now would be best described as potential, but unrealised, and with a good chance they'll finish 1-6 this stage. I have no choice but to have them this low. Then there's Houston, who again have generally been performing okay in a lot of their series. I don't really want to touch on the Jake situation due to the lack of info available. What I will say is that in his place, Lynx has for the most part underperformed, which has been one of the main reasons behind their struggles. The Outlaws at times will show their skill in moments of brilliance, such as their win over the Gladiators and taking the Justice to 5 maps, but they're way too inconsistent in their performance, meaning that despite taking maps, they're rarely able to translate one map displays across an entire series, which is why they keep losing, and as such, is why I have them placed so low. Above the bottom 4, in the bottom half of my power rankings, are the Philadelphia Fusion at 16, Paris Eternal at 15, Hangzhou Spark at 14, and New York Excelsior at 13. In many ways, both Philly and Paris hold many similarities in this current meta. They have a very talented DPS lineup, and at their best, when they turn up and perform, both of these sides can be very dangerous and cause teams I have ranked above them many problems. The issue, as you've probably realised, is how inconsistent both of these rosters actually are. Actually, perhaps inconsistent isn't the right word, as to be perfectly honest, most of the time they've just been consistently mediocre. More often than not, they'll simply flop and be absolutely battered by an opposition, as shown when the Fusion's loss to the Titans last week, picking up their wins mainly against the worst sides. Initially, it looked like Philadelphia were going to beat the Eternal at the beginning of week 3, but lo and behold, once again they crumble when it matters most, and lost yet another Game 5, which just seems bizarre to me, given how they were the side that initially gained a reputation for winning map 5s themselves. This is why I have Paris just above Philly, and on the whole they're showing us more negatives than positives, which is why they're so low, and they'll need their best performers soon and EQO to do really well in the next few matches if they want to pick up wins, with it somehow still possible for Philly to make the top 6. Hangzhou finally put on a good display this stage as they picked up their first win against the Chengdu Hunters after a competitive loss to the Excelsior earlier in the week, but has breathed life back into their challenge for a top 6 position. Their DPS showing in particular finally gave them a competitive chance and made the team look a lot more comfortable now within this meta, with the support duo of Bebe and IDK playing really well in my opinion. That said, this is the first time they've actually put together a good display, and against the unpredictable Chengdu Hunters no less, so we need to see more from them before at the very least I become more comfortable that they are stronger than this position I currently have them in. With Gouchway still growing into the fact that he's stuck on Orisa, will have less of an impact than he previously had. Then there's New York. Once again they look to be sandbagging the final stage of the season, in the knowledge that they've already locked up an automatic playoff spot as Atlantic champions. They started off on the right foot with a decent win over the Spark, but in general, their experiments so far have been nothing short of abysmal, as demonstrated in their ugly loss to the Charge afterwards. I'm sure that the fact that options like Pine are still not being tried out will continue to infuriate fans and viewers alike, and whilst they may be using the guise of experimentation, A similar sort of meta last year caught them out, and potentially could do the same here, with their normally reliable players like Mano playing very poorly at the moment. And it's only really out of respect for this side's quality I haven't placed them any lower, as well as the fact they beat the Spark this week. The teams I have in the middle of my power rankings, however, are the Florida Mayhem at 12, Chengdu Hunters at 11, Shanghai Dragons at 10, and then LA Valiant at 9. Florida are quietly on a really impressive run of form after a disappointing defeat in the first week of Stage 4. In Week 2, they took Washington to 5 maps and convincingly defeated London, and they followed up those impressive displays with another win against Toronto and a nail-biting loss to the Valiant that really could have gone either way. For that reason, I think a mid-table spot suits them nicely, as Sire Player, but also Gargoyle, have really propelled this team forward in Stage 4 to a position where they actually now have to be taken seriously, which is a massive stride for them. Chengdu, however, just do Chengdu things. They're a hard side to rank due to their unpredictability. On any given day, they could take down the best team in the league, and it wouldn't surprise me if they defeated the Shock in their upcoming fixture. Yet at the same time, they sometimes just lose all their quality heading into a match, as shown in their loss to Hangzhou, which is why, despite them being a strong side potentially, a mid-table spot is where I think they belong. Shanghai at 10 though is perhaps a little harsh, and speaks volumes to some of the quality of the teams above them. They're not a bad side at all, but unlike others around them, they appear to be taking steps back and not forward, with 2 disappointing losses to Toronto and San Francisco recently. Something's just not clicking at the moment, and this may be down to them not being able to play May Reaper comps that well. But if they can get things going in the last 2 weeks, it could still prove to be a very dangerous side. LA Valiant ran out the midfield, and this position just seems to suit them to a T. They have some very talented players in Kareev, Fiction, KSF, Agility as well as others, but they just don't seem to be able to beat teams like Seoul or those above them, but instead just scrape past teams just below them like Florida. But they started to put the pieces together for this stage, and in 2-2-2, and a late flurry could yet see them make it inside the top 12 as a solid mid-table side. Making up the core of my top 10 before we reach my top teams, I have the Seoul Dynasty positioned at 8, Atlanta Reign at 7, Guangzhou Charge at 6, and lastly, the London Spitfire at 5. Despite Seoul simply choking away a win against the Charge at the beginning of the week, I think their performance there, and in their match against Toronto, has shown the progression this squad has made since the start of the stage, with the tanks and supports really starting to find a groove. Again though, there were still issues with this Dynasty lineup, they're still so inconsistent, mainly in terms of their DPS performance, with Fitz, Fletter, and Illicit all having a mixed bag of displays, and this will need to improve drastically, and quickly, if they want to more consistently compete with top teams, and potentially sneak into the top 6, with 2 massive matches coming up for them this week. Moving on to Atlanta, I can already tell that some people will be unhappy with this position for them, and argue they should be higher. I'd love to do this, especially seeing how well Erster has been playing alongside the rest of the team. The problem I have is that they've only played 3 matches, victories against the Spark, Paris, and Houston, which just shows they haven't really been tested, despite also not playing last week. This upcoming week will be their true test, as they play both Washington and London, and their performance in these 2 series should give us all the information we need regarding where they should be ranked moving forward, whether that be nearer the top or nearer the midfield. Guangzhou had a great past week as they came back to defeat Seoul before dumpstering on New York to validate the progression they've made so far this stage, with the DPS duo of Nero and Happy continuing to pop off and play really well. It's important to remember, however, they could very easily lost to a Dynasty, and they did lose to London just a week before, so I don't think they deserve to be right at the very top, but they're gaining momentum at a rate or not, just at the right time, and in my opinion, are the most dangerous team right now that will be competing in the play-in tournament for playoffs. London themselves had a much better week, rebounding upon their horrible loss to Florida, while taking Vancouver to 5 maps, before handling Houston later on that week, in a win that almost guarantees them a spot in the top 6. The thing with London is that at their best, they're an incredibly strong team, and will be able to challenge anyone, which is why I have them in this position. Remembering they've beaten the Charge lately as well. The issue is that their performance is just too inconsistent, and can devolve into chaos, with Birdring in particular having awful showings on a regular basis, and it's for this reason I can't include them with my top teams for now, but that could change if they finish this stage strongly. Finally, we reach my top 4, in which I have the Vancouver Titans at 4, LA Gladiators at 3, Washington Justice at 2, and lastly, the San Francisco Shock at the summit at my number 1 position. Now Vancouver unsurprisingly sit above London Spitfire after defeating them 3-2 in a close series at the beginning of this past week. Ever since they've brought in Stitch alongside Haxor, they've looked much better at running the May Reaper comp, which has caused them so many problems in their pounding loss for Justice the week prior. Of course, they're still not perfect, as shown by some sloppy play at the beginning of their series against Philly, but all in all, they still look a very dangerous side with an incredible base level of talent that could return to its dominance if they're able to crack and master this meta, hence the high placing. Moving on, I'd understand if people are confused and unhappy with why I have the Gladiators so high, despite an up and down stage 4, with a 3-2 win over Dallas this week, another inconsistent display of their quality. Overall though, I think they've shown that when they play to their potential, with Shorth and Decay popping off on DPS, they're one of the strongest teams in the league within this current meta. Remembering that only the week before, they challenged for Shock all the way to 5 maps. We just need to sort out their consistency, and they'll be in a much better position, with their match against Dallas highlighting the difference in quality in the second half, when despite being 2-0 down, they turned it around and dominated. Now however, we conclude with my top 2, but I don't think many can have complaints about, given they are unbeaten and have looked very strong this stage in the Justice and Shock. These teams have adjusted the best so far to 2-2-2 roller, and for the most part up to now, have destroyed most of the opponents they've faced. Washington have perhaps lost a bit of their momentum after 2 series in 2 weeks took them to 5 maps, with the most recent one coming against Houston, which is why I don't think they're deserving the top spot. That said, Corey is still a beast on DPS at the moment, and given their 4-0 demolition of Vancouver is still fresh in the memory, I don't feel the need to drop them any lower for now, but we'll have to see whether they can complete an incredible 7-0 stage when they face off against Atlanta and Paris next week. San Francisco, meanwhile, have continued to build on strength after strength, and now look fully adjusted to the new meta and 2-2-2 roll-log. They convincingly beat a decent side in Shanghai at the beginning of the week, before ending it in a brutal victory over Dallas, where they look so polished, with Sinatra playing incredibly well. At this moment in time, they are a side I trust the most to perform at such a high level on a consistent basis, and they look set to finish yet another stage 7-0, although their remaining 3 matches will truly test them, as they have to face Chengdu, Vancouver, and Valiant. But if they win all 3, they are clearly the number 1 side in the league, and the favourites come the playoffs. And with that, we reach the end of my Stage 4, Week 3 Power Rankings. I'd like to thank you for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with my next Overwatch World Cup video, so if you enjoyed and don't want to miss out, please like, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter for this continuing competitive Overwatch coverage and content. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.